everybody, welcome back to another edition of PD and P-Dubs Unscripted. And once again, P-Dubs is on vacation, and so we have a guest joining us here today, another good friend of mine, AJ Weller. AJ, good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know I've been harping on this for about as long as you've been having the podcast, so it's about time.
Right, he says he's our number 2 fan of the podcast, so we figured we'd get him on here on the episode. And one of the things, like I said last week's episode, that Pastor told me I had to have a Cubs fan / a Seinfeld fan. We met that requirements last week with Dave, and once again, we're meeting that requirements here with AJ, as he is also a big Cubs fan and Seinfeld fan.
Big shoes to fill. We'll see how I do.
Right. I mean, I'm sure we can get some Seinfeld references here and there.
We'll sneak them in.
So yeah, AJ, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am a proud Immanuel alum, graduated in 2004. I'm sure if I'm wrong, my parents or my sister will gladly fact check that.
Will your sister listen?
Remains to be seen. If she knows that I'm on this, maybe just to try to troll me.
Okay, so I should text her and say, hey, check out the podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, I went here all 11 years, preschool through 8th grade. My educational experience through college, this was by far the place I found the most connection to and enjoyed the most. I think that it definitely prepared me for my career now. Definitely my faith as well. I went to church here through about 2019 when I got married, and then my wife and I decided we wanted to find a church home on our own, so that way it wasn't me bringing her here to Immanuel. I was really sad to leave. It was tough. But yeah, we found a great church in Mount Prospect where we live now, and obviously I still feel the pull to Immanuel because I'm, of course, your number 2 fan. I'm gunning for that number 1 spot. But,
yep, gunning for that spot. But yeah, and like I met obviously being one of the pastors here at Immanuel, but he was also, when I started here, the leader of our 20s and 30s group, so I kind of got plugged in there, and then we found our bond over heavy metal music, and have gone to a lot of concerts since then, and so...
Yeah, I think your very first day when you got ordained, I ambushed you and was like, hey, we have a 20s and 30s ministry. Come join us. And then you were sucked in. I'm sure that's how you would describe it.
Yeah, honestly, I remember it was like one of the first couple of weeks I was here, 20s and 30s went to California Pizza Kitchen.
Yes, for the fundraiser for the children, and there were some adult beverages consumed, but that was for the kids,
for the children,
because it raised the additional money for the school. So we were just being selfless,
right? And that was one of those I remember riding with you, and I can't remember who else was in the car.
Probably my sister. I don't know.
I can't remember.
Okay,
but it was one of those. I'm like, even though I'm from this area originally, I'm like, well, I don't know the quickest way to get to Deer Park from here because like I never came from Deer Park or Palatine to Deer Park or vice versa. And you gave me a ride, and looking back, I was like, man, I should have drove myself because that was way out of my way from Deer Park to come back here and then go home when like I just had a straight shot from Deer Park there. And then ever since then, I got looped into 20s and 30s at or 20s and 30s when you led that here. And, with those ordained prayers as you like to have me do.
Hey, somebody had to bring the church into 20s and 30s.
Right. So that was some fun on Sunday afternoons and watching cricket. And I still haven't figured out that sport.
We tried our best. I think I've still retained a little bit of that knowledge. I've moved on from cricket to Australian rules football, so I'm picking that one up. It's just more of an insomniac sport. Those 1 a.m. starts. That's what DVRs are for.
Yeah, no, I haven't gotten into that one yet, but... So that's why, and so AJ and me have remained good friends ever since, even though he left Immanuel to go to another church.
Yep, you stood up in our wedding.
Yep, stood up in your wedding, and that was a great time. And so, we kept that connection, and, like I said, he loves listening to the podcast, at least that's what he tells me. And so, and I get text messages every once in a while about stuff that's said in the podcast, so I know he's listening.
It's called fact-checking, or making sure that there aren't too many White Sox references.
Right. And oh man, so I just looked. The Cubs are up 3-0 already in the Sox in the second inning here in their first game. Kopech looks like a 3-run shot to somebody. Gomes is up to bat right now, so I don't know who was before him.
Oh, the Lord is working. That's all I can say.
So yeah, no more of checking that score anymore for the rest of the evening. Good thing we're here recording a podcast.
And not distracted at all.
Not distracted. Well, now I'm not, and I'd be shutting the game off if I was at home right now.
Yes, but we were distracted coming in when we heard that Rocky Wirtz had passed away, which we're both huge Hawks fans. And
Right.
actually, that was my bachelor parties. We went to the outdoor game at Notre Dame Stadium. Little chilly, but
Little chilly.
fun experience.
Fun experience. A little bit of a walk from the parking,
Oh gosh, that was brutal.
and then we got to see Touchdown Jesus,
Yeah, we did.
and Weezer played at one of the intermissions.
Yes. Yeah, that was a long day.
It was a long day.
Long cold day, and then they ran out of food. Remember that? We tried to get. I think we tried to get some chili or something.
Some food in the intermission because I didn't want to go during the first one because that's when Weezer played. So I think I went during the second intermission, and Hawks lost. But yeah, so that was pretty shocking news when you said that when you got out of your car when we got to Immanuel this evening that Rocky passed away.
So if our conversation trends towards sports,
yeah, I think
might be why.
I think people are used to that from P-Dubs and me that we get a lot of sports talks.
Personally, that's my favorite part of the podcast. But
is our banter at the beginning?
Yep, and then I go, the Jesus guy. Yeah, he's pretty cool, I guess.
Yeah, we have good points from time to time. But yeah, so today AJ suggested let's talk about if you want to share what it was because I can't remember the exact wording for it.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be interesting if we discussed. At least we each came up with 3 reasons for why we think the church is either struggling or big ticket issues facing the current church, and we're talking more about the global church as opposed to just Immanuel.
Yeah, I always say like small C church, the global church, so that's any church, just Christianity as a whole. And so we're going to kind of each take one. I'm going to go with one. We'll discuss, then AJ will go, then myself, and kind of go through our list there. And I really don't have a particular order for mine. I wasn't ranking them. But, I mean, I know the ones I kind of tend to get out a little bit on a soapbox about at time to time.
Our listeners are captive. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So, yeah, so my first one, then one of the ones that came to my mind is this idea of moral relativism, that everybody gets to decide what is right and what is wrong. And how dare you tell me that I'm wrong, in my opinion. And that's kind of contrary to the church when the church is like, here's what's right, here's what's wrong, this is a sin, this isn't a sin. And I think the younger generation especially doesn't like that mentality.
Yeah, and I know in the small group that we're currently in, we've had some discussions like this, and one thing that I've kind of reflected on and thought about over the past several months is, there are certain situations that we're put in where we may not know the right answer. Right. But I truly believe that there is a right answer and a wrong answer, right? So if Jesus was placed in this situation, what would he do? And that is unequivocally the correct solution to whatever situation arises. But I've kind of learned that we aren't going to have all the answers this side of heaven.
Right.
So I wholeheartedly agree. Like there's what the church is saying is biblical, and that's what we should be following. But also the Bible doesn't cover every exact situation that we come across.
Right, and that's where not every situation is a black and white answer. There's some gray area from time to time. But I think of like some of the general ones that no, that's I think everybody would agree. Like I remember when I was at Fuller reading some books about what they refer to as emerging adults, which is 18 to 25-year-olds, because now you're not an adult till you're 25. So you're emerging into adulthood in your late teens, early 20s. And the 2 that stand out to me in that book, the one book, I think it was by Jensen Arnott or something. Can't remember off the top of my head, but he was they were interviewing that age, 18 to 25-year-olds. And one was who am I to say that the terrorist is wrong if they kill somebody? If they think they're doing the right thing. It's what? No, that doesn't make sense. And another person, there's 2 other one. Another one was just I might think drinking and driving is wrong, but somebody else might think it's okay. So who am I to tell them that they're wrong? And it's just do you hear yourself?
Yeah. Well, those are certainly some extreme examples.
Right.
And thankfully, I don't think that's something that we face very often in our lives. I think, like you said, the vast majority of people are going to think that way. But yeah, I mean, there's certain hot button items, and I'm sure people can fill in the blank at what we might be insinuating, but it's, I think from your view as a pastor, it's certainly interesting. And then from my view as somebody who doesn't have necessarily the same educational and biblical background that you do, but has been raised in the church my whole life, where I've had various pastors and
Right.
teaching.
And
But
you've been an active leader within the
Mhm.
churches you've been at too. So I think that plays a role too.
Yeah, and it's challenging though because you don't want to be so off-putting
Right.
and really shove that down somebody's throat, but how do you also gently guide somebody to what the Bible is saying?
Right. That's that balancing act of like letting people like, yeah, I disagree, but not being like shoving the Bible down their throat where they're like, okay, they turn you off and they don't want to listen to you,
Hmm.
but it's doing it in that loving and caring way. Because one of the debates that like last year I had with not this, well, I guess almost 2 school years ago now, like the one big debate that came up and some of the middle school kids were always on my case about it. I'm like, well, that's fine. You can bring it up with God if you disagree, but the whole idea about like sharing Netflix passwords,
Oh,
is
okay.
that
It's stealing.
stealing or
Hmm.
not? And like, because we talked about that in confirmation, that was one of the quotes too. And one of the books I read was the person's like, pretty much the summarization of what the person said. It's wrong for me to steal from like AJ, me as an individual stealing from AJ as an
Hmm.
individual. But if I go steal from like Jewel or a big corporation, that's not as bad because it's not really affecting somebody like stealing from an individual. And it's just like,
Yeah, that's certainly twisting it and trying to be like almost like a Robin Hood
right.
figure.
Yeah, and so like, and then like when we talked about the confirmation, we watched, and I had to make a more modern update on the episode. But we watched I showed a clip from The Simpsons when
Hmm.
Homer gets an illegal cable hookup,
Oh, that's a good
and
episode.
Marge and Lisa don't like it, and thou shalt not steal, and obviously the younger generation doesn't get that reference
Hmm.
anymore because cable hookup, what is
Yeah.
that? And so I'm like, okay, that's like now sharing your Netflix password, like me sharing that with you right
Hmm.
now when we don't live in the same household, we're not family. And they're like, well, there's nothing wrong. That's just being a good friend.
Hmm.
I was like, well, by the letter of the law, it's not right.
Yeah. If you're not paying for it, then.
And so like that became, now I know now here in 2023, Netflix is really cracking down on
Hmm.
that. But so that's, I think, that idea of like, I think that's more of a not a huge one like the initial ones I shared, but that like sharing a Netflix password or something else of like, oh, it's not bad. It's not stealing. When,
Hmm.
well, technically, yeah, but it's not going to be the soapbox that I die on.
Yeah.
I'll be like, hey, this is what God's word said. And like, I tell the kid, I'm like, well, if you disagree, you can bring it up with God.
Exactly. And, that raises a good point. Actually, was something that I had listed as one of the things I thought was a challenge for the church right now is I think, collectively have too many hills we die on. It seems like whether it's hot button topic or something that can be construed in various ways, folks are really willing to just dig their heels in and not have a logical argument or discussion. But I also think it's probably a reflection of our culture as a whole these days.
Right. And I think it depends too on your given church. Because,
Mhm.
like, here in the LCMS at Immanuel, we're a very conservative church body. But then there's other Christian church denominations that aren't maybe as conservative as we are. And so there's a different view on some of those hot button topics.
Exactly, and the church that we attend now is non-denominational, and I think they strike a good balance of having the conservative views, but also allowing folks the freedom to have differing opinions, whether the pastor necessarily agrees with them or not. He'll let it be known if somebody wants to discuss it with him, but it's not a let me get at the pulpit and pound my fists and say thou shall not and basically terrorize
Yeah, the
people. Hmm.
hellfire and brimstone type of sermon.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that even too is like, I know, like, looking as a pastoral way, like from a pastor's viewpoint, it's that, once again, I guess everything's a lot of that balancing act of like, as a pastor, we're called to confront what's wrong in our society and things
Hmm.
that go against God's will. But as you said, you don't want to be so off putting where people aren't going to even listen to your opinion
Right.
and listen to what you have to say. And I think that is a big challenge for the church because people are like, oh, well, you're against my viewpoint on this. So you don't like me, you think ill will of me, or you
Hmm.
wish my harm for me. And that's the furthest thing from the truth.
Yeah. So how do you, as a pastor, then like strike that balance when you're at the pulpit, or maybe when somebody comes to you to talk about something that's a sensitive subject?
I guess from the pulpit, I'm more. I guess I'd rather talk more in like a Bible study setting over the pulpit.
Okay.
Like, and I'll preach upon like the different topics, but I'll keep it scripturally based. If somebody comes to me, it's that kind of keeping that level voice, not like accusatory, or it's like, hey, I'm okay if you have a different understanding. Like, it's happened in confirmation, or even a few weeks ago, I was hanging out with some friends and we were talking about some of these issues, and like I was like, I know you guys have a different opinion than what I have. This is what I feel, but I don't think any less of you guys, or think, oh, you're horrible people because you have a different viewpoint of me. But I'm like, this is what I'm coming to. I understand where you're coming from. And I don't, as a pastor, I never want to be the reason why somebody leaves a church or says,
Yeah.
Christianity, that's not for me.
Yeah. It's really tough to put on the delicate gloves, but also feel like you've guided somebody in the right direction. Neither one of us are parents, but I have to imagine that's what it's like,
Right.
is God looking down as in his heavenly father role and being like, I am there to provide guidance. If you do something wrong, there may be consequences, kind of like your parents telling you, hey, don't touch that hot stove when you're a little kid. Well, if you touch it, like, you're
Yeah.
going to get burned.
Right.
But they gave you the guidance, and ultimately you made that decision on your own.
Right. And I think, too, with that listening to somebody with a different opinion, some is that trust or that credibility that you built
Yeah.
up with that person. Because, like, thinking of people I was having that conversation with a few weeks ago, these are people that have known me probably 20 years because I knew them in high school. So longer than 20 years now because I knew them earlier in my high school
Yeah,
days.
you're old.
Yeah, I know. That's why I realized, like, man, 20 years out of high school, that's crazy. And some are listening probably like, that's nothing, kid.
No.
And so, but it's one of those, like, it hits you at times. So, like, we were talking, I was like, listen, guys, like, I know we know each other. We have that friendship where, like, it's not going to change that friendship that we have.
Yeah.
And so it's that trust where it's hopefully like, okay, we know him. It's the same person we've known our whole, like, for most of our lives. And it's, it's okay to have a different opinion.
I've always found that what has worked or maybe gotten the best reception has been, as these conversations have come up, have just to say, like, hey, here's my opinion. Like, and like you said, no, I know they're different, but then also say, like, it doesn't impact what I think about you as a person,
Right.
or how I'm going to treat you. Like, I love you for who you are, like, whether it's family or friends, but just to know that, like, whatever situations arise, I'm going to walk with you, because that's ultimately kind of what we're called to do.
Right. So that's where I think that comes in, is that, like I said, I go back to that balancing act of, like, you don't want to do something so crazy that people just, like, I think Pastor and me, Pete Ells and me talked about on one of the podcasts, or maybe the Gathering Place, where, like, or maybe it was just off being recorded, but like, you see sometimes like a street preacher with the megaphone and the sandwich board. And I'm like, does that really make a difference? I'm like, I as a pastor, I'm like, you're kind of crazy there, person.
Yeah, I've seen them while walking downtown, commuting to and from the office, and I've had that same response where, are you really, meeting your goal? Sure, you could proselytize and yell at the masses, but have you accomplished anything other than just drawing attention to yourself?
And people are like, okay, well, I don't want anything to do with that person.
Yeah, I know I don't, and I'm probably agreeing with some of the stuff that they're saying.
Right. Which is just that interesting, like, thing. And so, yeah, so I think that's where it's that figuring out and, like, coming to an understanding and knowing, and obviously there are certain hills that we have to die upon.
Yes.
And, like, but there's other ones, and sometimes we make some of these mountains bigger than others, and we let other things that would be against our viewpoint as a conservative Christian, and we just kind of ignore that one.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm like, and I'll admit that in confirmation on some of these subjects, like, guys, the church hasn't always handled some of these situations in the best. We overlook this, but we, like, really go hard against this. A sin is a sin in God's eyes.
Right.
And I always do, like, the vertical view and the horizontal view of sin, where, like, horizontal, you're looking and then you see the different, like a bar graph. But the vertical view, when you're looking down from the top, everything is the same.
Right.
And I always say, like, stealing a stick of bubble gum is no different than killing somebody in God's eyes.
Yeah, I tend to think about it too, as even if, I have a bad thought, right? It, like Jesus said, if you've committed that sin in your heart, it's equivalent to doing the physical act. And it's just like, even a thought like that, Jesus felt the pain on the cross and the isolation on the cross because of that. And it's like so mind blowing that, here you have these people that are committing horrible actions physically to others, and then I commit something in my heart, and it's like Jesus was up there thinking about both of us in the same loving way, and it's an incredible thought.
Right, and like the grace and mercy that he shows us. So yeah, so that kind of, I think, wraps up that talk a little bit. And so like my second one I was thinking of was just like scheduling, and people are so overcommitted and where church is not a priority for people.
Yeah, or overcommitted in terms of just even helping at church, right? Like I know that I think any church you're at, there's a lack of volunteers because, like you said, folks are overcommitted, but then the people who are serving are overcommitted at the church, and that's not a good balance.
And then
either.
they burn out, and that, on the last week's podcast with Dave, I kind of mentioned, we talked a little bit about that, where I said, the old saying is like 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. So it's always the same 20% doing most of the work, so it burns them out.
Yeah.
And like, we are such a busy schedule. Like, I still remember like talking to somebody, and they were talking, it was after kind of last year, I bet, because it was kind of when COVID was slowing down. And the person was like, I'm kind of happy because I miss the busyness of life compared to like during the lockdown when everything was so laid back and everybody was at home.
Yeah.
And I was like, that was an interesting comment that just stood out to me because I was like, I don't know about that. Like, part of me kind of liked the slowness and not the busyness of the overcommitted schedule, but it shows that's what our people are accustomed to, and that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Yet during the middle, they're like, "Oh, I'm so busy."
I've had people ask me if I would be a hermit if I wasn't married, and so I'm probably somebody who really enjoyed COVID for that reason.
Right.
Like, hey, I don't need anything on my schedule. I'm perfectly content.
And as long as you had your Cubs and Seinfeld that you could watch.
For a while, we didn't have the sports there, but those were dark times. We don't need to go into that.
But you still had
therapy.
Seinfeld to watch.
Yep, a lot of good stuff still on. I had a good point and I lost it. Well, I'll come back to it. Keep going, and I'm sure it'll strike me, and then I'll.
But
just
yeah,
interrupt
so
you.
I think it's just that idea of like, so like when you look at our priorities and people fill out their calendars, it's like, well, I got to do this for my job. I got to do this. I got to take my kid here. I got to do this. And then it's like, oh, we'll squeeze a little bit of Jesus time here or here. And then it's like we give him our leftovers.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking for reminding me. The phrase that's been used in a couple of sermons recently at our church has been, you pursue what you prioritize. And I think that's a perfect example of it. Are we really prioritizing Jesus? Now, don't get me wrong, there are certain things like we need to prioritize. Got to pay the bills. I got to work. I got to feed myself and my family. But and then there also might be times where maybe there's illness in the family or something that you need to prioritize over maybe regular attendance at church, and that's completely understandable. But under regular circumstances, like Jesus and your relationship with God should be your number one priority.
Well, that's like I've always thought about, like with my father growing up, like, he was Catholic growing up, or when I was growing up, and even me, like working at Jewel in high school, I was like, hey, I can't start work till 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, so I got to go to church, and Jewel's cool with that. So, I was able, and that was a high school job. But like my dad being a firefighter, that's not a job he could say, hey guys, I got to go to church before I come in when you're working 24/48s. So I understood on every third Sunday when he'd be working 24, he'd be at the firehouse because he started a shift at 8 a.m. And then on another third of the Sundays, he'd be showing up late because he'd get off shift at 8 and come right to our 8 o'clock service at my home church. So I understand like that, like police and those types of jobs, you can't push off. And it's not saying that that's more important than God, but it's just the way your schedule works because, people in those type of professions have different hours than most people.
I don't want my trauma surgeon, stopping surgery on me, 15 minutes before church starts so he can clean up and go. Like, hey, excuse me.
But it's different than and that's different than the person say, well, I can't go to church because I got to go get home to watch the Bears game, or I got to skip out church because the Bears are playing at noon.
Or I'm tired of that. We actually have somebody at our church who's in our small group who works on Sundays, and he is scheduled it so that way he can take his lunch break during church. So he'll come to attend church and then go back and finish his
So that's
shift.
a great example of how to make both things work, and it still shows that God is that number one priority in your life.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so, like, yeah, and like I said, that's more some of those are not the black and white, like firefighter, police, paramedic, doctor. But in the other ones, when it's like, oh, I gotta do this first, and
Mm-hmm.
like, and you see that I think a big thing is like sports for kids on
Yeah.
Sundays, like that used to never be a thing, or
Mm-hmm.
businesses being open because I think nowadays it's just really Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A closed on Sundays.
Yeah. I don't do a lot of shopping, so I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, but I mean, like grocery stores, like I know
Mm-hmm.
Jewel's only closed Christmas
Christmas. Yeah.
Day. So, like, it shows like people are working, but 40, 50 years ago, not as many places were
Right.
open.
Yeah. It's definitely a byproduct of our culture. There's this sense that I think if you aren't doing, you're missing out.
Right. Kind of that, the younger kids like to say FOMO,
Yeah.
fear of missing out there.
Is that a young person saying? I feel like that was something that came out like 10 years ago, so they may not know what
So
we're
maybe
talking
it's
about.
not a young person saying anymore, you know. But yeah, to me, it feels like the younger generation, that FOMO. So yeah, so what's your next one on your list?
Yeah, so mine is making Jesus a prop, whether in politics or for commercialization. It grinds my gears to no end to see somebody stand up on a soapbox and use Jesus' name for their gain and immediately turn around and do something that is completely contrary to that. Now, I'm not trying to insinuate that I expect those people to be perfect because obviously nobody is. However, it can be really apparent when somebody's out there using Jesus' name for his own gain. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of politics, but that's something you see a lot. Or I think about a lot of like mega church pastors, especially what we've seen in probably the past 10 years or so with a lot of fall from graces of those large church pastors where all the stuff that came out, yes, they were doing a lot of good, but it seemed like a lot of it was self-serving.
Right. And that's the thing is like people use Jesus for their benefit, not in a negative way, because obviously
Mm-hmm.
we all use him as a benefit as salvation through his death on the cross and resurrection.
Yes.
But to prove my point or like use him in a way that feels just inauthentic, and I think that's a key is like you want to be authentic, and that's
Yes.
what people are looking for is that authenticity, vulnerability. But I think when you're using him as I think you're referring as a prop to like promote whatever purpose you're trying to, it doesn't come across as authentic, and it comes across as cheap, and people are gonna read right through that.
Yeah, and I know there's a band that we both like, Perfect Circle, where they actually have a song where they're describing their view, and at least the guy who wrote the lyrics is not a follower, but he's talking about how instead of just talking like Jesus, try walking like him and being that example. And I remember hearing that song for the first time and thinking, that's incredibly profound. And he did it in such a way where it's not attacking, people of faith, but really calling out the hypocrisy to what he was seeing in a lot of the church or the evangelical culture this day.
Right. And that can be said kind of similar thing, maybe not, but similar, I guess, is like The Simpsons. Like there's a book I have in my office called like The Springfield Reformation,
Hmm.
where it's saying, the creators of The Simpsons, Matt Groening and James Brooke, are both atheists. But what they're doing when they do kind of take shots at Christianity is pointing out what's wrong with
Hmm.
Christianity. And it's interesting because they actually compare him to Luther, saying that, Luther is pointing out what was wrong with the Catholic Church with indulgences and
Hmm.
all that stuff. And that's what The Simpsons is doing.
So you're saying the theses that he posted were the original Simpsons episodes?
Yeah, yeah, the 95.
There you go.
But it's so like, being a big fan of The Simpsons, at times I'm like, I can kind of see the point they're trying to get across. And
Hmm.
yeah, like, I don't always agree. Sometimes people do use their faith in a negative way, and it's not beneficial to the church, and it's not the way that God intended it to be used.
Hmm. So we just took a trip to Utah, and Utah's got a lot of Mormons, and we won't delve into the differences in faith and is it really Christianity, all that kind of stuff. That's probably its own separate podcast. But the one thing I thought about was the perception of Mormons, and we during our travels just stopped at the BYU campus to check it out. And the one thing that struck me as I was looking at a lot of what they had was I feel they do a very good job of living what they preach. So you always hear about Mormon missions, right? Like
Right.
they're actively going out into communities and serving. And you just think about, in the way they're doing it, and their end is misguided, but what would it look like if the modern day church did that on a mass scale, just like the Mormon religion does? And you think about who they are. I don't know if I've ever met somebody who had a poor thing to say about Mormons, because they're characteristically very nice. They're very selfless. They will work to serve others. And it's like that is really what we're called to do. And I would just love to see that happen
Right.
globally from the church.
Right. And we kind of hit upon, I think, kind of maybe too last week on that with Dave, was that whole idea of like, as a Christianity and like sharing the message of Jesus, everybody's called to do that, not just a few people.
Right.
And we're all called to do that, which kind of, I think, leads into my third one of like, I think a problem and issue the church is facing. I don't know if this is just a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and it's just because that's what I know most about. Well, know something about, I guess. And that is like the number of people going into church work, whether it's a DCE, pastor, Lutheran educator. Like, I see the numbers that they share at different conferences of like how many numbers of guys at the seminary are starting to be a pastor. And like, I think when I started my fourth year, my class, we had about 100 guys, or maybe a little less. I can't remember. It was right about 100, and we had a couple of people not signed to be pastors, but going for different degrees, maybe like 3 or 4 deaconess students. So, we're 90 to 100. The fourth year is when I started. They had like 150 guys in their class. Okay. So, in that 4 years, it dropped like 50 guys. And then this year, I think Concordia St. Louis Seminary maybe put out between 40 and 50 guys as pastors. And so it's like you see that decline of guys going into the ministry. And I know like even the numbers at Concordia RF for different things are down for like church work, like DCEs and teachers, I believe. But it's like, who's going to be the next leaders of a church? Because that's the thing. Like even myself, like when we were talking last week, it's like on the podcast, like I've been out of seminary for 12 years. So not that I'm old, but you're still getting like more. And it's like, okay, if there's less and less in the future generations, who's going to be leading churches? And then that means there's going to be fewer churches of training up and building the future generations.
I also wonder if it's a shift to a more contemporary or evangelical style of worship. I can't speak to that in other denominations or evangelical, but I think you hit on a good point. And it probably also, again, reflects our culture at large, right? If and we almost had made this a topic of discussion, like why are millennials leaving the church? But that, our generation, those are the ones that would be graduating from seminary, and I think it's
even now you'd be getting into Gen Z a little bit, because I graduated in 11, so I was 26 going on 27. Okay. So that'd be a Gen Z, I think.
Okay. But I mean, as the generations have evolved, it certainly, we're seeing a shift, right? Where Christianity is becoming less and less important. So, like you said, then there's not going to be somebody when
I got to get to retirement in 30, 40 years.
Exactly. Now, it is job security for you.
True, but
so
that's good. But I even think too, like, is it that? Because I remember graduating high school. I knew I wanted to be a pastor out of high school, going to Concordia, and it was one of those. I'm like, what type of person's 18 and wants to be a pastor?
Yeah.
What type of people am I gonna be like the only one? And then even going to seminary 4 years later, it's like, are there that many people my age that are going into ministry? Because, it wasn't like all my friends were Christian in high school and that I worked with, which is fine. You can have friends that aren't Christian. But it's like, what's it going to be like? And you just don't know. And obviously there was plenty of people.
I wonder, too, if maybe more people will follow Pastor Warren's example of being in the workforce and then feeling called later in life.
Right. And I bet out of my time at SEM, like my group of guys I graduated with, It was probably a 60-40 split, I bet, or maybe 50-50 of like first career, like myself, straight from the traditional route of like college or seminary, compared to, and then like on the other side, those that are second career
Hmm.
guys, which is what Pastor Warren would be.
Yeah, I know. I had at one point, maybe 5 or so years ago, considered
I think we even talked a little
doing
bit
that.
about
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Ultimately, I decided, no, it wasn't what I was being called to do. But I think we have to have faith that God is always going to provide.
Workers.
Yes, exactly. Now, the trend is certainly in the wrong direction, and how do we reverse it is going to be a challenge. But it it does lead to long term questions for what does the
Right.
church look like as our generation gets older, and then people who are age are having young kids, what it looks like as they reach adulthood and
Right.
are in their 30s,
So it's
and
just
having a better podcast than we do.
right. They'll have better technology at that point and better editors and
Mhm.
producers than this
Yeah,
podcast.
and I also said we, like I'm part of this
Yeah,
podcast.
you're. Yeah, so maybe you and me will start our own podcast. I'll have two podcasts
Yeah,
going.
Pastor Moore will get Wally pipped.
No, we can't Wally Pip past P Dubs. P Dubs, he's a mainstay here.
Yeah, Pastor, I know you're gonna be listening to this, so I apologize.
Yeah, so don't take him seriously, P Dubs. You will always be the part of P Dubs Unscripted.
I,
Can't do this podcast full time without you.
I got the dubs for the last name, so I'm
You
I'm
do,
halfway there.
you do, but yeah, we'll start a second podcast where we'll just talk sports.
Sports and Seinfeld.
Yeah. So then let's bring up your last point as we wrap up here.
Yeah, I think another challenge that I've seen, and maybe this is more so evangelical or large churches, excuse me, would be a shallow faith. I feel like people aren't necessarily getting equipped to face the challenges in life and be able to push through them with God's help. I've heard many examples of people saying like, "Oh, I lost my faith, during a really difficult time in life," and think, well, okay, I understand the challenges that would come with it, but why would you struggling with something push you away, like somebody dying or a health scare? It At least in my opinion, it's a time where I try to lean more on God and think about that as opposed to just being like, oh well, a loving God wouldn't let this happen, and I'm out.
Right, and I think that's the thing. The people have either two responses in those times of hardship, either to draw closer to God or they push God away.
Mhm.
And like that's where like having that in like that's what I preached upon not well a couple weeks ago by the time this comes out, but when we talked about the parable of the sower, the different roots and the different soils and like the one that gets scorched out because it didn't have those deep roots and once
Mhm.
something goes awry, this isn't what I signed up for. I'm leaving.
Yeah, and, I think at times people can have the misconception too that the Bible is meant to provide an answer for everything, right? Like it does in a sense, but there are things that again we don't know. I think about like the age of the earth, right? Like, people yelling at the top of their lungs that the earth is 2,000 plus years old because we've,
Well, 6,000,
six
but
thousand, whatever. The chronological sequence of it, and then you have people screaming, "No, the Bible isn't a science textbook." And so, when we were going through creation in the days, was it really a 24-hour day, or was it just meant to represent a passage of time? And I don't know where I was going with that, but it felt like a really good point to make.
But yeah, but I mean, I look at that like, and this is my simpleness of looking at like the days of the creation is like, in the Hebrew it says yom, day, yom in the day, and every other time that yom is used, it's a 24-hour
Hmm.
period. So why would it change in that
Sure.
case? And if we say God can't create the world in six
The-
24-hour
mhm.
days, he's not all powerful.
But couldn't he have also created it in an infinitesimally small amount of time?
He could have,
Mhm.
but I just say that, this way said he did day one.
Sure.
I'm taking the Bible at its
So
word.
he was just he was doing like a union 6 days of work, right? Just kind
Yeah.
of stretching it out,
Well,
letting it breathe a little bit, maybe taking a long lunch break.
it ultimately goes back to he set the example for what our
Yeah,
schedule should
I know.
be. I got to keep this, theologically correct here.
I know, and I'm just trying to give you something that you're going to have to edit out
Yeah,
later.
you're
Make it
trying.
work.
Oh, that won't work. It's good to play devil's advocate from time to time. But yeah, I think that's the issue. Is like people want everything to come easy, and when it
Hmm.
doesn't, this isn't going to work. And so I'm going to turn to the next thing.
Yeah.
And when you have that solid roots, you understand like God told me, Jesus said it's not going to be easy.
Hmm.
I'm going to have these hardships, but at least I have Him with me. Because that's what I look at. I'm like, there's all different hardships I could share about, but I'm like, the only reason I got through them is through Christ, who
Hmm.
gave me the strength.
Exactly. And I also will reflect back on difficult times and think, you know, or go maybe during it, what's God trying to teach me? Or I'm very blessed to have not been in this situation before, whether it's a family member dying or a really bad illness or an injury. There are people who face these challenges every day and are
Right.
in way, way worse circumstances than we ever are. People in third world countries who couldn't dream about what we experience, and our biggest trial and tribulation might be completely trivial to them because they're just trying to survive.
Right.
And my cell phone died and I had to, borrow somebody's, and it's like, oh, the world's coming to an end.
Right. The whole joke that people say first world problems.
Exactly, exactly.
But, Jesus is that answer to all those things. Like, yes, that sounds very cliche, but, He was there in all those hardships in our lives. Whether we realize it or not, God was working through the people that He placed in our lives to always be there to give us strength.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's the one thing that we have to rely on. And I know as a pastor, you've been trained for that your whole life, and you can go back and think about, okay, what does Scripture say? But from somebody who doesn't necessarily have that from an educational background, but has
Right.
grown up in it, it's one of those things like, how do we teach the next generations how to do that, or even our own generation?
Right. Yeah, so these are all good, great things that we've talked about. And so I don't know, AJ, if you have any closing thoughts.
I just hope that the Cubs won.
Yeah, let's hope not, but I doubt that's going to happen.
No, but I appreciate you having me and putting up with my nonsense for, what's it been, a year and a half of doing this?
Yeah, we started in February of 2022.
Okay, yeah, so you've put up with a year and a half of me
So
of basically saying, when are you going to have me on,
yep,
when are you going to have me on?
76. Well, this is our 77th episode we're recording right now with you. So 23 away from 100.
And seven's the number of perfection, so I guess I'll come back on your 777th.
Oh man, that's a few years away, my friend. So, I'm just looking forward to that 100 to say, hey, we have 100 episodes. We got a triple digits here.
There you go.
So we got to figure out something special to do for the 100th episode.
Invite back your favorite guest, and then we'll see who you guys really like.
Well, your recurring guest shirt will be in the mail.
Thank you. I'm a schmedium.
Okay. So yeah, thank you, AJ, so much for joining us, and just appreciate the friendship over the years and just that your willingness to come in on a Tuesday night to record this. And thank you, everybody, and God's blessings.